Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be back with you again, or I should say probably morning for my dear friend Fiorella Isabella, who's currently on the other side of the ocean to me. Well, we're back with Critical Perspectives. We finally found a name for the show and the conversations that we have, which for us are very cathartic, and I hope they are for all of you also. And tonight we're going to be discussing, first of all, the situation in Syria that I recently wrote about for UK column, talking about the uptick in the Takfiri purges across Syria and the forest fires that have been, in my opinion, allowed to blaze out of control and further ethnically cleanse the ethnic minorities in the coastal regions, particularly in Latakia. So before we get into that, Fee, what are you going to look at this evening?
Yeah, well, good to be here with you, Vanessa. Absolutely, we need these conversations because there's something happening every day, and I do feel like something is coming to a degree, and then I go back and think like what hasn't happened in the especially last 2 years, but really since 2020, things have seemed like they're on acceleration. And being in the United States right now has been quite just shocking for even though like I have come back. This is the longest I've been here in a while, and it's really getting to me. The conversations being had here, actually there's some positives in that. There's the lifting of the veil from the Trump MAGA people. That I'll be talking about that. Trump's betrayals regarding Epstein, the big beautiful bill, which is a literal giving in to not just big tech, but Israeli intelligence, huge corporate sectors, Palantir, AI, and all of that. That actually pinpoints to where we're going foreign policy wise in the United States. And there's a lot of that happening. So yeah, I'll definitely be talking about that. And I definitely want to talk about the perspective when it comes to Iran and how, that Tucker Carlson interview with Pezeskian really it was received very differently by the Western audience versus the audience from West Asia. So yeah, a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. So coming back to Syria quickly, Syria and Lebanon, really. Of course, the news of the week is the Trump administration lifting of the terrorist designation of Nusra Front, or HTS, as it's also known now, of course, and therefore freeing up basically the Takfiri unelected regime in Syria to receive weapons and economic support from the United States at a very critical juncture in the region when Israel has obviously accepted the ceasefire with Iran, but we should know from history that Israel doesn't accept ceasefires unless it has another direction in which it wants to pivot. Of course, we saw that most recently with the ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon back in November 2024, and almost immediately the Takfiri attack on Aleppo and the eventual fall of Damascus happened immediately after that. So, I think when we look at everything in this kind of continuum context, we understand that each section of the roadmap is not separate at all. And when we're getting distracted, as we've talked about before, with these claims that Netanyahu and Trump are falling out and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, people celebrated the ceasefire. And of course, everyone is going through dissecting the war and who won and who got the most benefit out of the war. But of course, that's important. But we also should be looking at why Israel accepted that ceasefire. Where is it heading next? And what appears to be happening, the pressure now is mounting with the arrival on a number of occasions now of Tom Barrack, Trump's golfing business buddy, who's been made a very inexperienced peace envoy or special envoy to the Middle East, who's been in Lebanon heavily lobbying for the disarmament of Hezbollah, the resistance factions in Lebanon, while of course not recommending any restraint whatsoever from Israel that is assassinating individuals on a daily basis. They're encroaching further on Lebanese territory. They're digging in, they're creating actual kind of settlements and bases. They're detonating homes in the south on the border with occupied Palestine. And they still have occupied the 5 highest points in the south. And in the last 3 days, they've actually carried out an assassination in the far north of Lebanon in Tripoli, which is pretty unusual, while of course they've continued bombing the eastern flank of Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley. But perhaps the most interesting kind of discourse that is ongoing at the moment is the rumors, many of which have been generated by Israel, that Jolani has basically put some kind of deal on the table with Israel. Now, part one of that deal is to divide the 1967 occupied by Israel Golan territories up into 3 parts. One part will remain with Israel. The other third will be leased to Israel for 25 years, which of course effectively means Israel continues to own it. And Syria allegedly will get back 1/3 of the territory. The other deal means basically that Israel would get the majority of the territory that it illegally occupied. Syria would regain only 1/3. But as part of that deal, Syria would annex northern Lebanon. So that would include Tripoli and the Bekaa Valley and that whole section of the north, which Jolani is now calling Greater Syria. So we now have Greater Israel and Greater Syria, not really competing, of course, because whatever plan that Jolani puts into action is not his own plan. It's the plan of Israel, the United States, and the UK, because in the last 2 days, this has all been happening, by the way, while Netanyahu is in Washington courting Trump and giving him another weird present of the B-2 bomber that allegedly hit the Iranian nuclear facility in Fordo. Quite obscene scenes actually coming out from the Trump Netanyahu meetings and dinners and so on. And of course, Trump being nominated by Netanyahu for the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, honestly, we are entering some kind of the whole dimension gets weirder and weirder on an almost hourly basis. So basically, yes, this has only been reported by Israeli media, but I am actually being told by various sources inside Syria. And one Telegram channel contacted me basically, and they said they'd also heard rumors that Jolani is preparing military factions to invade and put pressure on Lebanon, that Jolani will be perceived as the regional security, in inverted commas, enforcer on behalf of Israel and the United States. And so basically, while, you know, people here do view these claims with some skepticism, I think what we have learned from what happened in Syria is that we shouldn't take these rumors lightly, and we shouldn't underestimate the potential for there being a major threat from the Syrian region against Lebanon, but not only against Lebanon and the resistance in Lebanon, also in Iraq, because we've seen an escalation of activity, particularly in the Kirkuk region and in the Erbil region, where tribal factions are being turned against the former PKK factions and so on. There is an indication of destabilization projects being started also in Iraq. And of course, the threat to Iraq comes from the holding camps for the ISIS fighters and their families in the northeast area, which are currently under the control of the Kurdish factions or the YPG or the SDF, whatever you want to call them, among their many rebrands. And so what is clear right now is that, in my opinion, what the ceasefire is going to allow Israel to do is to obviously replenish its munition supplies, repair any equipment that was damaged in the 12-day battles with Iran, which of course were instigated by Israel. But it's also going to attempt to seriously weaken or completely eradicate the resistance in Lebanon, which then, of course, opens the door for Israel to again invade southern Lebanon up to and perhaps beyond Beirut. We don't know. I wouldn't take anything off the table. And at the same time to weaken the resistance factions, which include, of course, the PMU and Kataib Hezbollah and various other factions in Iraq, to prepare for a future escalation against Iran. And at the same time, of course, there's the issue of the Zangezur corridor, which is in the Syrian area of Armenia, so the south of Armenia on the border with Iran, where they're trying to create a competing transport corridor to the north-south corridor that has been part of the strategic partnership between Russia and Iran for more than 20 years now, actually. And America now, of course, is talking about running the corridor through corporate entities, which of course we know translates into private military corporations, just as they've done to basically occupy Gaza and to carry on the ethnic cleansing on behalf of the Zionists inside Gaza with the Gaza Humanitarian Fund's aid sites, which, by the way, are now being reduced from 4 to 1 for 2 million starved Palestinians, deliberately starved Palestinians in Gaza. So I think, we were talking about this, and I think we were correct in saying the ceasefire, while it may have been necessary for Israel because it was running out of particularly air defense interceptor missiles and so on, it's not a producer of the majority of the munitions it uses. It requires replenishment of stocks, but at the same time, it enables it to focus on the weakening of the resistance axis, having, of course, secured the fall of Syria. And now it looks like not only the normalization between Syria and Israel, but strategic security partnerships between Jolani and Israel, of course, being forced upon Syria by the US, that is, as I said, now left the terrorist designation. And using Jolani and the Takfiri forces, particularly the foreign Takfiri forces. If you remember, America originally said, we want them gone. Now, of course, they're being converted into brigades that are lining up along the eastern border of Lebanon. And there have been ISIS and Takfiri cells captured inside Lebanon that were intending to carry out suicide bombings. And it's interesting, just to finish off, the Takfiri purges of the ethnic minorities are now very much focused around Homs, which of course is to the north of Damascus, very close to the border with Lebanon and close to areas on the Lebanese-Syrian border that were traditionally Hezbollah strongholds. So it seems very clear that the push from all directions inside Syria is to ethnically cleanse the minorities that might object to the Takfiri ideology and settlement program that's ongoing inside Syria, but also to secure territory in that border area from which potentially to launch not only ground attacks, but also missile attacks and artillery attacks.
There's no coincidence that this is all happening right now in congruence with the timing of after the failed attacks on Iran, because that was a huge failure for the United States. And I think they've realized that they need to specifically continue targeting proxies, including the resistance in Lebanon. But as you said, this has been planned for a long time. I mean, this is all part of the Abraham Shields. And what we need to understand, or what a lot of people in the States need to understand when this ceasefire idea is being pushed by the likes of the United States and Netanyahu and the Israeli entity, that this is not a legitimate ceasefire. This isn't a legitimate attempt to give some sort of justice to Palestinians. And I get so irked because I am seeing that idea that, oh, we need to push for a ceasefire. We need to it's just not enough doesn't begin to uncover it, because we have the same people who destroyed, who are ethnically cleansing, not just people in Gaza, but the entirety of the Palestinian people, who are now attacking, they have been attacking essentially the entirety of the region, specifically to not just capture all of Palestine, but to, of course, expand Greater Israel. And what you're talking about that's happening in Syria is all part of that mechanism that has long been planned. And the Western audience is sold this idea that there is going to be a ceasefire. And Trump and Netanyahu, specifically Trump, has been waving a banner of like, oh, we're going to bring an end to this. It's going to be great, blah, blah, blah. And it's this very arrogant attitude that we know is a lie. We know what that means. It means the end of Palestinians. And specifically, I'm glad you mentioned Netanyahu in DC, because if anybody is at this point still talking about a feud between Netanyahu or between Israel and the United States, I just want to throw something at them. Because, and I've seen it, and I know you have too, and we've seen this. I'm not going to mention names, but I've just seen it everywhere because it's been a lot of people. And this isn't the first or even second time. This is like the third or fourth time when people are just saying, oh yeah, Israel and the US are done. They're fighting. Trump doesn't like Netanyahu. And here comes Netanyahu saying, we have one objective, one same goal. We're in this together. Why does he made fun of the people who say, unlike some of you have been reporting, he was like, when will they understand?
I completed a second meeting with President Trump. I want to inform you something that will shock the various reports that come out. President Trump and I have a common goal. We want to achieve the release of our hostages. We want to end Hamas rule in Gaza. We want to make sure that Gaza does not pose a threat to Israel anymore. In pursuing this common goal, we have a common strategy. Not only do we have a common strategy, we have common tactics. This doesn't involve pressure, doesn't involve coercion, it involves full coordination. President Trump wants a deal, but not at any price. I want a deal, but not at any price. Israel has security requirements and other requirements, and we're working together to try to achieve it. Everything else that you hear and are being briefed on is folly. It's about as accurate as the reports that you had before the Iran war, about the great tension between us, about the great disagreements between us. And I say, when will they ever learn? I don't know. It's not important. We're continuing, we're pursuing this, and I hope with impending success.
Mr. Prime Minister Netanyahu, is pushing out Palestinians to countries where they have no connection to going to make Israel safer in the long run?
We're not pushing out anyone, and I don't think that's President Trump's suggestion. His suggestion was giving them a choice. You have a choice. Where do you live, madam? Where do you live? In D.C.? Are you an American citizen?
Yes.
Do you think you have a right to go to another country if you seek to do so?
But, sir,
the Palestinians should have that right. It's called the freedom of choice and nothing more than that.
Sir,
No
Prime
coercion,
Minister,
no forcible dislocation. If people want to leave Gaza, they should have the right to do so and not be held at a point.
And I, what I said to that, I said is, the Israelis, the Zionists, people like Netanyahu, who are absolute psychopaths, pure evil, they're telling you everything truthfully. Like they've told us how they want to eliminate all Palestinians, including children, including babies. They've told us that they don't want a two-state solution, that they don't want any of that. They've told us that the United States is literally shared in this goal and this objective of making sure Israel expands. And yet you have Americans, people in media, analysts, commentators, journalists, throwing these ideas that the United States and Israel are not aligned somehow, or that this is just Israel in control of everything. And the reality is the United States is very much on board with what Israel is doing. It needs Israel just as much in many ways as Israel needs it. This is more than Israel. What we're seeing in the world is this ideology of supremacy, that it's being led by Zionists, but it's not it's not only in Israel. This is clearly the sentiment and the actions being laid out by the West, I would say the collective West, but there isn't really an opposition to it. And we can talk about that later. Not a strong enough opposition with the greater powers, China, with Russia. There is an awareness of it, but there isn't really a full-on understanding of what this is, I think. And I had to comment on that because there is no feud, there is no misunderstanding. This is the reality. The United States' plan has been, and Israel's too, with Abrams Shield, is to isolate Iran, which is what they're trying to do by attacking its neighbors, completely promote this idea that there's going to be an end to what they say, right, is the Gaza war, which we know is the Holocaust. And they're going to try to say they're going to end something by essentially installing their own system and their own military sectors within Gaza, within the illegally occupied West Bank, the Palestinian territories that are left. And they're going to try to sell you this idea that that's going to be the end of what's happening in Gaza. And I think that's the next part. So people can start relaxing and feel like everything is fine. And Americans will buy it because they're already buying a lot of things that they're selling. And Donald Trump has become actually a pretty hateful figure here. When because of the last few months of BS and complete and total disaster that's happened, and Iran has come out of this extremely well in many ways, but the danger isn't it hasn't gone away, and I'm glad you pointed that out regarding Lebanon, and you pointed that too this months ago, I think, when we said, where is this going to next, at least a few weeks ago. And it was very obvious that Hezbollah had to be targeted because Hezbollah has been one of the strongest, I would say, of the resistance in their support of the Palestinian cause, and also as just in general as a faction. They're extremely determined and strong. And the United States has long had their eye on Hezbollah. They've long tried this time and time again, and they haven't succeeded. But now we have a fall in Syria. And so I think for people who think this is all just, this is Syria, there's Iran, or there's, the big, beautiful bill, all of these things are entirely connected. And that's where our money in the United States, the Pentagon, and all of this is going. It's directly going to fuel this war against the resistance, this war essentially against the entire region that is resisting intervention from the United States and Israel.
And I think another important point to make, and that will probably bring us on to the whole Palantir aspect also, and your amazing work on the big, beautiful bill. I don't think I've seen anyone delve into it to the degree that you did. But if we look at, a lot of people have picked up on the fact that, of course, Iran has an independent banking system. Syria had an independent banking system. But also Hezbollah has an independent banking system. And while it's not a state actor, it's a non-state actor. Hezbollah has huge popularity in Lebanon. And I was talking about this the other day, about the fact that they have their own banking system, whereby anyone in Lebanon, they don't have to be part of or affiliated with Hezbollah. They can bring their gold deposit it, and they're given the equivalent of the value of the gold in a loan, right? And the gold sits there. It doesn't gather any interest for Hezbollah. And when you've paid off your loan on the agreed payment scheme, you come back and collect your gold. So there's no loss whatsoever involved in it. It's just basically you're taking your gold from your house and you're putting it somewhere else. You're taking the money to carry out whatever project you need to do. And then you can go back and recover your gold. And of course, this is complete anathema to the World Bank and the IMF and Western banking investment paradigms, right? Which is totally based on usury and exploitation and extortion and enslavement, debt enslavement. And so all of these countries have a system which does not reflect the need of the US-led supremacist bloc to enforce their own form of debt enslavement on whatever country they're targeting. And that's a very important point to make. The other point that I want to make, which is a little bit more complex, it's the religious aspect of what's going on. And I'm not looking at it from how can I put this? If you look at who is driving the Zionist agenda, it's actually the majority, the Christian Zionists. We know that Trump's administration is packed full of Christian Zionists, which is an oxymoron in itself. But nevertheless, we know that they believe in an end time, and the second coming of Christ needs this kind of apocalyptic era in order to generate that second coming. And that's the whole argument in the occupied territories over Al-Quds and between Al-Quds and Temple Mount. You know, the Zionists want to destroy Al-Quds, which is, I think, the third most holy site in Islam, and build their own temple over it, etc. So the religious aspect, if you look at Netanyahu's language from the very beginning, the end of the Amaleks, the calling of the AI genocidal systems like gospel, etc. Right? So this biblical theme has been running throughout this intensified genocide. This one that began on the 7th of October, of course, the overall genocide has been ongoing since 1917, actually. What this is all about, and when you look at what's happening in Syria, it's the ethnic cleansing of all the minorities, which includes Christians. Why? Because that then creates a battlefield which is between Takfiris and the resistance, which is predominantly Shia. So we have, if you go back in history, you have the risk of a new Karbala, which however many thousand years ago was when Imam Hussein was slaughtered with his followers by the followers of Umayyads, which are now how the Takfiri factions describe themselves in Syria. So in my opinion, this is also what we're heading towards. We're heading towards a driving out of the Christians, which has been ongoing for decades. You know, even during the regime change war against Syria, Christians were given almost immediate access to countries like Canada and so on. Huge percentage of the Christian population in Syria was driven out by the Takfiri attacks on their communities during the 14 years of regime change war. And now we're seeing it again. We're seeing life in Syria being made impossible, particularly for Christians, for Alawites, but also now for other minorities, even for the Druze, etc. Right? So I think, honestly, this is where we're heading. And people are probably going, oh my God, this is too much. But if you look at it another way, and you look at it with Zionism and Christian Zionism, and therefore the US as the driving force, the GCC bloc, so that means Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, as the GCC bloc, that are presenting themselves as this Muslim unifying force, bringing in global capitalism to the region and peace, which a lot of people are falling for, by the way. A lot of people have been messaging me recently and saying, but this is really good. Until I say to them, what does Muslim unity mean? What do they mean by this? The people that are selling this, what do they mean by Muslim unity? Do they mean unity with all Muslim factions? No. They mean Takfiri unity. They mean Umayyad Muslim extremist unity, because even moderate Sunni Muslims will reject this ideology. And they're also being targeted, by the way, in Syria. So it becomes very clear to me where we're heading right now. And if you want to put it in more realpolitik terms, it's the GCC against the Iranian bloc. It's led by Saudi Arabia and the whole GCC bloc, backed by the Zionists and the US and the UK, against what they perceive to be the Iranian bloc, which to some degree brings in Russia and China also. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, and it's also been outlined entirely. I mean, the thing about the Zionists is they tell you exactly, and also the United States in many ways, if you pay attention, they tell you exactly what they're going to do before they do it. You just have to pay attention. And they have literally said, we're going to use the GCC, the Gulf states, to isolate Iran. And it is very frustrating, I think, to see people fall for that. When you talk about Arab unity, it doesn't mean, or it's not supposed to mean unity against the enemies killing you, right? The enemies bombing you, because that's essentially what it means. In greater, I would say, aspects of geopolitics, that's who you're aligning with. That's who they're aligning with against, their own people. And I think that there is a criticism to be said there, with that. And the religious aspect, I think, is also, we can get more philosophical about that. But it is extremely interesting that there is such a thing as Christian Zionism, because in many ways, Christians are being slaughtered by that very entity. And there's nothing Christian about a Holocaust or a genocide. There's nothing Christian about that in the religiously historic lands of, Jesus Christ, like in this area that is so biblical for these people. I mean, it's almost, you step back and look at it from that perspective and you're like, wait a minute, like this is crazy that this is happening all over again. And especially when you talk about the slaughtering of children, which is something that did occur a long time ago, according to the Bible. And it's historically has been the story within, the Jewish, the Torah and the teachings. And it's also part of the Old Testament. And so you look at that and you're like, this is all quite interesting that we're coming to this here. And on the other side of that, of course, we have the literal blueprint of the United States' plans when it comes to their focus on specifically targeting Iran, China, and Russia. And I guess my question, Vanessa, to you before we head on over there is, what do you think is then left for Russia to do? Because from my perspective and my years now of being there, it has always led, and we've talked about this numerous times, a soft spot for Israel, not just culturally, because Russians are there, but beyond that. And this is direct interference. We're seeing it with Azerbaijan, and we're seeing it with the economic interference also from Turkey. The betrayals coming from the sector, which are essentially attacks against Iran and Russia from the West. Another front. They're being attacked yet at another front. And you're seeing that there seems to be, from my perspective, a realization in Russia as to what the attacks against Iran were. Because I think there is an internal division in terms of this sentiment against Israel, because clearly several sectors of Russia don't want to don't want to really force Israel to do much. I mean, you can see these condemnations from both Russia and China, but you don't really see anything happen from these condemnations. And they talk about diplomacy as if you can be diplomatic with a genocidal entity. And as they've seen themselves, especially Russia, with what's happened in Ukraine, there hasn't been diplomacy. There's been a shift in the narrative from Donald Trump regarding Vladimir Putin, right? There's been this shift where he has now began talking about Putin not wanting to stop killing Ukrainians, that he's not happy with Putin, that he's going to send more weapons into Ukraine, that he's not going to stop. But in all of this, we're also seeing the revelation that Trump is very much not in charge, and that no US president has been. And Vladimir Putin recently made a comment talking about, essentially men in suits controlling the government. What he's talking about is the intelligence apparatus. And this all gets really kind of crazy because, there was a point, and I still think Russia is more than willing to have some sort of arrangement or negotiations with the United States. However, I think that after Iran and what the United States did and how Iran responded, I think that also set out a certain vibrations out, I guess, in the world, particularly in Russia, where they're realizing that they will be a target eventually. And I think they know this. I think Vladimir Putin isn't dumb. I think he's aware of this, but there has to be some sort of decision to be made soon, because now there's not just economic interference. There's threats. There are threats being made still by the United States against Russia. There are proxies being used against Russia while simultaneously talking about peace and all of this stuff. And so my question is, what then does Russia or China make out of what happened with Iran? Does this change anything? Are we seeing the potential for them to maybe take a different direction than they had initially anticipated?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I would love to say yes, but I was actually today doing a lot of work on the various competing economic corridors. And what this throws up is Russia's dependence on Baku and Azerbaijan for protecting its South Caucasus, basically, influence. And this puts it, in a sense, in direct confrontation with Iran. Because I was talking about this Zangezur corridor, right, which is in the southern area of Armenia, on the border with Iran. Iran is not happy about it because, again, it's going to close. It's also going to interfere with that north-south corridor that Iran and Russia are setting up or have been working on for the last 20 years. It's just been stalled many times, basically a lot to do with the American sanctions and the lack of ability to invest in it. And also, so Iran is putting forward this Aras corridor, which is basically dropping below the Armenia border line into Iranian territory to try and offer an alternative to the Israeli, basically, corridor, because Israel will have influence with Baku. Israel's been supplying the weapons to Azerbaijan, and it effectively controls Baku. Baku's been supplying the oil to Israel throughout the genocide via Turkey. And for Russia, of course, the threat also is from Turkish expansionism through Azerbaijan and through Baku. So Baku, in a sense, is becoming this conflict hub in that entire corridor region. And it has potential to make it difficult to achieve the North-South corridor agreement between Iran and Russia. It also means that Russia is to some degree looking for a way to protect its own interests, which may at some point clash with the interests of Iran. So we're in a very sort of delicate area at the moment. And of course, also, if you bring in another BRICS country, which is India, which of course is establishing the India-Middle East economic corridor from Mumbai through the GCC bloc, through Israel, Egypt, and into Europe. So you've got so many competing, you've got Turkish middle corridor also trying to exclude both Russia and Iran. You've obviously got China's Belt and Road Initiative. So at the moment, this corridor war is actually central, I think, to how Russia's policy will pan out towards Iran and even towards China, I think, personally, when I'm looking into it. I need to continue looking into it because it's very complex. But for Russia, the priority is to prevent Turkish expansionism and Turkish control of the South Caucasus, which then will have a knock-on effect of the former USSR republics, of course, and lead to potential for Russia being faced with further destabilization on its borders through those republics, which of course has happened historically also. Now, if Israel increases its influence in that region, I'm really not sure which way Russia is going to go. And at the moment, Israel is what is keeping Russia inside Syria, in my opinion. And Russia needs that base in Syria to expand its operations in Africa, as we've talked about before, and in Libya. So I think if we look at Russia as a very sort of pragmatic player, ultimately it's going to put its own interests first. Of course, it's not going to try and scupper the strategic partnership with Iran. But ultimately, when it comes down to the line, if it's a choice between Israel and protecting Russian interests over what Iran can offer, then I'm afraid Russia will go with Israel, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I do see
Yeah.
certain pushback within Russia, and this is something that it exists everywhere. Just like in the United States, people are realizing a lot about Israel, and there is a lot of pushback. There's a lot of hatred actually for Israel, unlike anything I've seen before. I definitely did not see that sentiment before. And so I think that is actually, it does exist in Russia, but there is also the interests and that aspect of money. And the influence of Israeli Zionists within the Russian sector. So I think that's a question that we'll have more hints as to how that develops. And yeah, I also need to look further into that, the economic corridor wars, I guess, because when you talk about real politics and you look at pragmatic players, right, like Russia and China, which both are, that actually points to a lot of things as to how
and
they
also
proceed.
Not forgetting what Robert Kennedy said, and he couldn't have been more blatant even before Trump was elected and before Kennedy came on board with the Trump campaign. He was very clear about what the role of Israel was for the United States, and it was effectively to prevent any growth in influence and power of Iran, Russia, and China. And so that explains to me the influence of Israel over the last few decades in Azerbaijan, which is kind of interesting to me because Azerbaijan is majority Shia Muslim. I think it's something like 50 to 60% Shia, 30 to 35% Sunni Muslim. But still, Iran is worried about the potential for Turkey to stir up nationalist fervor among the Azeris that are about 16% of Iranian population. So it's not a negligible percentage of Iran's population. So there's a lot at play here. And I think, again, what we shouldn't forget is that the war against Iran isn't over. We only saw one of many stages, just as we only ever saw one of many stages in the last 75 years of the war against Syria to bring down an independent government in Syria, to destroy their independent banking system, to put them under the control of the IMF and the whole kind of Western monetary fund enslavement. this is always my problem with many analysts, and the thing is, when they accept the pause as being something permanent, they have an effect also on people in the region, because people in the region are still very affected by Western media and even independent Western media commentators, right? And so in a sense, we have a responsibility, without sounding, ridiculous about this, but we do have a responsibility to point out, even though people are going to accuse us of being blackpilled, we're not. I've written about Iran's ring of fire, the power of that ring of resistance around the US and the GCC is what is so potent. That's what is such a potent threat to Israel and the US. And that's why this war is in no way over. We've just ended one of many stages. And now we're in the next stage. A friend of mine here, who also, Fee, but she said to me the other day, she said, it's too quiet. I don't like it. It's too quiet. There's and that's how everyone is feeling here. They're all waiting for the next assault, basically.
But that's the truth. I mean, that's how I'm feeling. And I think unfortunately in the United States in particular, they don't really get that. They don't understand, when it's too quiet, there's something going on. And that's what worries me night and day, honestly. Since I really haven't slept normally since 2024, I swear. It's just been one thing after the other. And the thing is, looking at it from the psychopathic US perspective of these people in charge, they are very much forging ahead, and they have plans when it comes to Iran. There is no way that they will allow Iran to come out of this successful or continue existing the way they are without literally throwing everything at them. And that's what we're seeing in their legislation. And this is quite important, because it does kind of signal to everything we just talked about and everything you just mentioned, Vanessa, where the US is going into with such fervor. So if y'all want to check out my Substack, I did a piece on the Big Beautiful Bill. That was the name that Donald Trump gave this almost 1,000-page bill. And this is funny and relevant because he always criticized the Democrats for having these thick, long bills full of a lot of hidden things. And then he literally goes and does that. And this is because Donald Trump is not, he's a figurehead. Presidents aren't really running the United States. And that has been more clear, more recent than at any other time. Because he wasn't even aware that the U.S. stockpiles were running low. And that, I think, was actually a genuine revelation, because there are things that he is not aware of. And when you look back at Joe Biden, there's a reason why we were able to have a senile president for 4 years without, with things still running to a degree, and it's war still continuing and genocide happening, because he's not running the show and everybody knew it. Well, neither is Trump, really. And this is not to release him of any fault, because he's very much betrayed his entire group of supporters. The reason this is relevant is because I think in this way there is some sort of enlightenment happening within that sector a little bit, to the degree that I think they didn't expect. And so, along with the Epstein cover up, which is essentially what it is. Oh, there's nothing there.
Happened.
Nothing happened. The guy just killed himself. Ghislaine Maxwell's in jail for nothing,
for nothing.
So I think that was probably the biggest betrayal for them, because this had to do with pedophilia, sex trafficking. These are very passionate topics for a lot of these people that have been on that. There's also the surveillance state, and the idea that Donald Trump was going to take on the deep state when he actually just gave the entirety of the American population to Palantir. And so this Big Beautiful Bill essentially was like the cherry on top to everything that has been going on, because since Trump took office, Palantir received $113 million worth of basically chunks, even in one sector. They're involved in the Department of Defense, they're involved with the ICE raids, which we've talked about before, the technology that they're using, and they're also involved, of course, with partnerships with Israeli intelligence. And it all makes sense once you look into it. So, of course, symbolically, Donald Trump signed this bill on July 4th, the American Independence Day. And I haven't been in the United States for this day in a very long time. And I usually try to get away, because it's usually the most annoying day in the world, when it comes to US patriotism, when it comes to people wearing the flag and not realizing what we're doing. And this year in particular is probably one of the last years I wanted to be here, because of everything that's happened since, the genocide, the wars, and people, and just I thought that I would come back and see like people celebrating as usual, and actually that's not the case. And that's actually, we are supposed to be blackpilled, but I will say that has been one positive thing that I've seen is I haven't seen the rah 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 from the same people that I would normally see. I have family members that were Trump supporters, huge Trump supporters, and are extremely angry at him with with what's happening in Gaza, Israel's influence, and the surveillance stuff. So they have just essentially called him out. And so I do think that it's not just an internet thing. I do think that people are angry with the current administration and are realizing that this is just more of the same foreign policy. In fact, it's a continuation of that foreign policy, because in this bill that was initially, of course, not backed by everybody, but then, of course, they had to get most of the bills. Thomas Massie is one of the ones who stood against it. But everybody has been focused on the social aspect of this, which is not minimal. I mean, it's gutting healthcare. We already basically have the most terrible healthcare. Even when you pay for it, they try to make you prove that you're actually sick enough to get some sort of test done. And that's been the story from many people close to me. So healthcare, it's gutted healthcare, it's gutted social programs. It's going to make people who have student loans pay higher interest. It's making it more difficult for people to just get their health taken care of. So all of that is true. And it's really a punishment on people who basically are what we call in the United States, the middle class to, the working class. However, what people have failed to talk about, and what Democrats won't talk about, because this is also their war plan, is the sector that is related to the defense spending. And in this in particular, we have to talk about how this is a merging. I think one of the first times we're seeing so much AI being put into the forefront, and drone repair, drone warfare. That's where the United States is putting all of its weight behind. It's really a reflection as to how they're going to operate. The only amount of money being spent domestically is to spy on the American people and control their movements. So we're talking about, for example, the border policies, right? When Donald Trump came out and tried to get people on his side to vote for him, he was talking about reining in illegal immigration. But now he's building these prisons. And then people were saying, well, this is okay because he's going to clean up house. He's going to get rid of these undocumented people that shouldn't be coming in here. He's we're taking care of business. And in reality, though, we are building more prisons that we don't need. And the surveillance that is being used is technology that will not just be used on undocumented people, but will also be used on American citizens, because it is part of a whole network. And that's not going to go away, or decide that because you're not because you're a US citizen, it won't be used against you. And that is essentially what is in this bill and what people have been ignoring. I mean, we're talking about their focus also on cyber warfare, billions and millions of dollars going into that. You're talking about DARPA's fingerprints being used in the AI developments. And so this essentially is focused on, even though it's not primarily laid out there, they focus on weapons used by Iranian, Russian, and Chinese proxies, or what they view as proxies.
Yeah.
And they are focusing pretty much on this technological surveillance complex being built up in order to essentially carry this out. But all of this technology that's already been given to Palantir is creating a network on every single American and every single person that lives in the United States. And it's almost like they're bringing the war, the technology that they use abroad on their so-called enemies, and using it against their own people, while continuing to put funds to continue the wars against Russia, Iran, and China. And the reason we know this is because they're focused on the particular combating the missiles, the same missiles that China uses. So they're focused on that, the same missiles that Russia uses, and they are looking into specific regions in the South China Sea. So when we talk about all the geopolitics that we just talked about, there is really no break here. While the United States is quiet, be aware that they are advancing. And I'm not saying this to say they're undefeatable or omnipotent or anything like that. But what I am saying is there isn't a moment that they're not trying to continue their antics when it comes to, especially right now, Iran. Because if Iran can go down, then they can fully focus on Russia and then China. And as you just laid out with Azerbaijan becoming the sector, that is also a targeting of Russia. And so that's why I think we've seen also a language shift on that. There hasn't been a single war ended under Trump. There have been more wars essentially started, or at the very least continued. And the thing is, there is a huge amount of weight being put in to this war technology. And one of those things is, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard about this one. It's the Golden Dome's missile defense system, right? And this is like, it's very similar to the Iron Dome. And so you know that there's a definite conversations and traces between the Israeli apparatus and the United States, because it has essentially the same name. And basically what this would do, and this is Trump's project for the United States, is it would basically be the Iron Dome for the United States. And there's putting so much money into this. Why would they do that, right? Why would they be doing that if they weren't anticipating something? And we talked about the potential for false flags. We've talked about, July 4th has come and gone and there hasn't been anything, but we also said that would have been too obvious of a date.
Yeah.
And so I just have to point out that what it seems like the blueprint for the next Trump administration, and actually beyond the Trump administration, because some of this goes through after Donald Trump is here. And this is how you know that it truly doesn't matter, because either way you would have seen this carried out. You have a specific Israel and Indo-Pacific focus on billions for the Indo-Pacific. So you know that they're going to build infrastructure there against China. There's also army exercises laid out against China. There's missile defense being built in Guam. And they're also replenishing their stockpiles, which are low, apparently. And that has a lot to do with continuing to support Ukraine and Israel. So what we aren't seeing is an end to any of that. There is like, it's almost, I mean, I think Americans should be extremely angry, because all of this money is going directly for Israel. And that's the one thing I have been seeing, Vanessa, is that people are starting to develop this awareness as to, wow, I wasn't aware Israel was embedded in every facet of our government. What exactly, why is that? Why is that happening? And so that is the one thing that I have seen. But, when it comes to these things, these bills, nobody reads them. I mean, they're too long. I mean, even if you're a president, you don't read them, but they get essentially summaries from their secretaries, right? And then they're given this summaries and they're like, all right, okay. But this is, we're talking about as Americans, you should be angry because you're talking about warrantless data collection. You're talking about warrantless surveillance. You're talking about, what's happening on the streets right now in Los Angeles, where vigilantes with no tags or no identification are taking people and throwing them in the back of vans, which is actually happening. And most people aren't really talking about that, but I guess that's protected. And there is less and less and less freedoms for people in the United States, while simultaneously the war machine is just, full throttle. And so there needs to be that connection made between what the geopolitics is at on the world stage and what's happening in the US. And we can talk about how great BRICS is and how it's going to provide a different new alternative. But before any of that happens, one, you still have the United States going to throw everything at the table until it can't. And you still have the existence of Israel and their expansion, and the United States continuing to throw billions to that. So how can we even think about developing a different world if we're not really developing anything different? We're just simply saying, okay, well, now 2 more people have more power, or 2 more entities have more power. So what are you going to do with that? It's just been really frustrating on that end.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point there. Nobody is trying to knock any attempt to create a non-aligned axis, which is what BRICS represents. But that non-aligned axis should be held to the same account as any other power complex in the world today. Of course, it's not going to be equivalent to the destructive policies of the US-led Israeli bloc, which includes, of course, the UK and the EU, et cetera, and the GCC, and so on. Right. But still, if we're going to celebrate, or if we're going to perceive BRICS as being a true alternative and a bloc that does uphold international law, which has been shredded by the US and Israel and the entire filthy alliance, or satanic alliance is about the best way I can describe them right now, without getting into hyperbole. But you run out of descriptions. Then we have to hold, for example, Russia to account for its kind of lukewarm dealing of the issue of whether it came to Iran's aid in the war against Israel or not, and so on. And we've talked about this also, how it behaved towards Syria, etc. But even for China, the fact that not only is it pretty much number one in the trade listings for Israel, but Chinese state companies have actually invested in companies inside the occupied territories that are carrying out the settlement programs against Palestinians in the occupied territories. So we should be engaging with China over this and saying, no, that's not on, because Israel is an entity which is violating every single humanitarian law that has ever existed and every single international law on the rules of war and occupation and so on that have ever existed. So if you're going to put yourself forward as an alternative to the US law-breaking bloc that has destroyed global security, right, then you have to adhere to the global security that you're purporting to uphold. Otherwise, that image is fractured. And I think going forward, we can't just be looking at another alternative, which when it comes to power, is it then going to do exactly the same as the United States? Right? Because we have to see that there is a support for the equity of all countries, including countries that are right now being marginalized by the US, occupied, devastated, their resources stolen, and so on. And so that, I guess, is my view about BRICS. I'm all for an alternative, but I want to see the alternative providing something that is going to provide humanity with a better future than we're seeing being rolled out, right? Across the world, across the globe. And coming back to your point about the continuity of presidents, it doesn't matter, the whole uniparty thing, which is a fact. Look, if you go from Biden to Trump, when do we ever hear a sensible answer? Biden, to a degree, as you said, was senile, but nevertheless, he was allowed to just come out with rubbish. But Trump's no different. He doesn't give a single direct answer to anything, and he flips and flops from the morning to the afternoon, right? But this is deliberate because, as you said, they're not in control. So no one really cares what they say, actually, because damage can be mitigated. And to a huge degree, Trump is sowing confusion, which is what they want. They want a confused public. They want people going from this policy to the other policy and, oh, he's just contradicted this policy. Of course he is, because he's not in control. The roadmap is continuing regardless of what the Trump caravan does on it. Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, right? And all this draining the swamp and all the rest of it, forget it. It's nothing to do with that. It's not going to happen because the billionaire class, which is in control of everything that's going on, is not going to relinquish control to effectively he's just a member of the billionaire class. So why on earth would you put your faith in a member of the predator class that is, as you've said, through his big, beautiful bill, going to enslave and crack down from a tech surveillance perspective on the American population? But I want to just very quickly cover this whole scandal about the Tony Blair Institute being involved in the plan for Gaza. Because again, this demonstrates, you remember when people on social media were arguing with us that Palestine is only one issue, Trump's going to bring peace and blah, blah. He didn't start any wars. That was one of the biggest arguments that was flung at me when I was trying to point out that Trump didn't start the wars, but he didn't end them. And actually, he laid the ground for Biden to do what he did in Gaza during his administration. And if you go back to the first Trump administration, he was already putting through these economic plans for Gaza, which were being rejected. So just as they rebrand the terrorist factions across the world, but particularly in Syria, to give them plausible deniability from the crimes they committed when they were Al-Qaeda. They're still Al-Qaeda, but they're given a new name. They're taken off the terrorist designation list, and hey presto, they're men in suits doing the bidding of the United States. But you go back to the Trump first administration, he brought in the Abraham Accords. He talked about moving the US embassy to occupied Al-Quds. He gave the Golan occupied territories to Israel. He brought in the economic plans or schemes for Gaza back then. They weren't accepted. So what happens? Biden comes in and obliterates Gaza, right? He carries out the genocide that is necessary to bring the Palestinians to their knees to accept the Abraham Shields plan, which is now being presented as the Great Trust from a demolished Iranian proxy to prosperous Abrahamic ally. And it's even more disgusting than it was back under Trump's first administration, but he set the groundwork for this. The expulsion of 25% of Gazans. So that's 500,000 Gazans. the reduction in humanitarian aid, as I said, from what was originally 400 distribution sites under the UN to 1 for 2 million people in a section of Gaza that's already tiny, in a section of Gaza that is diminished down to being, I think, around 1/6 of the whole Gaza landmass, for 2 million people that are being bombed on a ongoing basis. I mean, we've seen a steady stream of mutilated children on social media since October the 7th, and it hasn't stopped, regardless of all of the deviations in Trump's policy and the so-called rifts and so on. It hasn't stopped, not once. Not for any ceasefire, not for any other war that is being conducted. It didn't stop, right? And when you look at the map for Gaza, it's an Elon Musk Trump project. There's a whole Elon Musk smart zone. There's the Trump Riviera project, which is included in this. There's GCC influence putting forward 53 billion through the Arab League for reconstruction. Of course, that'll be controlled by Egypt, which is already in full collaboration with Israel since 1979, when Egypt was the first to normalize with Israel through Sadat and the Camp David Accord. But what I'm saying is, when you go back through history, you can see the steps that each president has secured in this path to effectively exterminating Palestinians, ethnically cleansing them, relocating them, making life so difficult for them. And I want to take this from the FT article. So they're going to put Gaza public land into trust for development. Like, this is the most sick form of the 1948 Nakba ethnic cleansing project. Assets will be sold to investors via digital tokens and traded on blockchain. Gazans can contribute privately owned land to the trust in return for tokens, which gives them the right to permanent housing units in concentration camps. I mean, you talk about the bill for the US. It's what is happening in Gaza is going to happen in the US. It's going to happen in the UK. The Zionist infiltration in UK government and across all sectors of society in the UK is exactly the same as is now incoming in the US. And exactly what is happening to Gazans on this unbelievably horrific scale is going to come to the populations of America, the EU, and the UK, unless you come into line, unless you de-radicalize, and unless you disarm. Of course, that's an issue which is relevant, particularly in the US. Because all of this, Palestinians having rights, is totally based on their demilitarization and their de-radicalization. In other words, abandoning any kind of political resistance and agency. The Palestinian cause will be finished if their plan goes through. Of course, I'm not saying, as you said, they're not omnipotent. They're not, but when you look at what they're proposing and how they're trying to bring this to fruition, it's pure evil. But that same evil is being incubated in the US and the UK and the EU and in all the allied countries. The GCC isn't going to escape it. I mean, they're already despotic anyway, but ultimately Israel isn't going to allow them to have the potential to wage war against Israel at some point in the future. Like, all of these takfiri elements that Israel is going to harness against the resistance are going to be expendable eventually also.
Yeah. I mean, if they learned anything from the United States and Israel's previous allies that ended up, 6 feet under, I mean, that's what's going to happen to them regardless. And, as we start wrapping up, there's a couple of things I wanted to touch on. And I'm glad you said that what's going to happen or what their plan is for Gaza and for the greater region will come to the United States, because that is their plan. I mean, that is, and we're talking about psychopaths in charge, like Alex Karp, who is one of the founders of Palantir. And I don't know if you saw this video, Vanessa, but it's a video where he talks about how he wants to spray fentanyl-laced urine on negative analysts, and by that he means people who are dissidents, right? And so when we talk about the persecution initially has been, okay, the undocumented workers, then it was like, oh, the pro-Palestinian protesters, that was also a thing, and then now it's like, oh, those who are allied with Iran and Iranian terrorists. I mean, that's where we're going, right? That's where we are actually, and where we're going is pretty much anybody that disagrees with the establishment will be either with Trump's own words, sent to a foreign prison, will be deported to somewhere, even American citizens, not just ones that are naturalized, but those born in the United States. This is already part of the vocabulary, part of the conversation. So what Vanessa said is entirely true because it's already happening in the United States. And there's only so much time that the people there have to wake the hell up before they can't do anything about it. And that is why this is such a big deal, because it's not the most snazzy topic when you talk about big tech or surveillance, but it is a huge part of what's going on geopolitically, and what we need to look to. And that lack of understanding of what's going on in West Asia is a huge blind spot for many people in the United States who have just simply think that that's the way the Middle East is. That there's always wars, they're always fighting. This is what they say. Oh, it's just just these religious wars and blah blah blah. They don't really know anything about people in Iran, and that's one of the reasons why I think that this interview with Tucker Carlson pointed out the wrong things about what was actually up for discussion. People took it as, oh, let's make this about Tucker being allowed to interview the president of Iran, and people criticizing him for doing that because Iran is a terrorist entity, they're a dictatorship and all of these things. So he got criticism for that. But on the other hand, people were saying, oh, this is great, it's good, we need to have these conversations. Americans need to see who understand what Iran is and that they're not a threat to US peace and that they're peaceful people and they don't want this war and blah blah blah. But what wasn't really being discussed is why people from the region, people who are from Iran, or a lot of people who live in neighboring states, were upset and actually didn't receive this interview, not because of Tucker Carlson or anything he necessarily did, but because of Pezeshkian's performance, the way he, in my opinion, and I think there's a difference because I have been there, and I don't generally live in the United States. For me, it came off a bit groveling, a bit submissive, a bit weak, or actually a lot weak. He came off as belittling the Iranian strength, and sort of attempting to promote this hippie kumbaya attitude and diplomacy with a genocidal entity that is literally murdering and has murdered entire families and his own people. So for me, that was what I saw and felt. But for the vast majority of the American audience, they thought this is a good thing. At least he's going out there and having these conversations, and they focused on the American perspective of Iran being enlightened. But it's kind of like, what's the point to enlighten some of these Americans who aren't, at the end of the day, not going to sacrifice a single thing for what the United States government does to Iran? And that's the thing I grapple with. Like, I'm glad, yes, that there are some people who are completely unaware of any political notion of anything, that maybe see Iran as maybe not a threat, because this is what we grow up with. The same way China and Russia are evil, so is Iran. I mean, especially people who are a bit, I guess I would say 50 years old and above, they've been told Iran is going to kill them all and attack them, and this is what they believe. So in a way, I understand the perspective that, okay, well, maybe now people think that less because of Israel, and how they've essentially ruined their own reputation by their just complete and total the demonic actions that they've been doing. But I think it's more, there's more than that, because the focus shouldn't be on the how Americans will receive it. That's not the point, that's not really what we should be going on about. And it seems like there's still an attempt to appease the Westerners that it should be actually irrelevant, in my opinion. But I don't know. Let me know what you think on that.
I guess, yeah, I mean, I'm in total agreement with you. But I think what for me is kind of interesting, I think if for example, this was a ploy by the United States to show a weak Iran, and to kind of bring in the reformist government representative to pivot back towards the US again and kick off the negotiations, even though Israel and the US were the aggressors without any provocation whatsoever, right? So you would expect any other nation, I mean, if, for example, well, we wouldn't even be having a conversation if a country had aggressed the US, that country would just be no longer existing on the planet today, right? But I think for me, if I have to look at the positives, when Pezeshkian was elected, it was after, of course, the mysterious death of President Raisi and the foreign minister Abdul Hayyan, which did leave a degree of a vacuum in Iran from a perspective of the government being very much aligned with the IRGC and with the supreme leadership, with the Ayatollah and so on, right? Then the election was for very much a reformist government led by Pezeshkian. But what the Israeli aggression did, and of course it came on the heels of the genocide in Gaza, the assassinations of Hezbollah leadership, including, of course, Syed Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, the fall of Syria, and Yemen's defense of Gaza and defense of the Genocide Convention. People had already begun to understand who the enemy was. So for years, these, let's say, dissidents within Iran who'd been protesting certain policies of the religious leadership suddenly realized that, oh, hang on, maybe they were right all along. And then, of course, Israel bombed pretty much all of Iran, killing civilians, killing military command, killing doctors, killing scientists. Whole families of nuclear scientists were wiped out. Civilians, children, women. Suddenly, the people were united behind the IRGC, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the army, because the three sections, if you like, were working together. So I think now Pezeshkian coming out and kind of not honoring the courage of Iran and the Iranian people, and not honoring the martyrs, it's very important in Iranian culture. Yeah. Has lost him the support even of the reformist crowd that are now behind the IRGC and behind, like, they're angry that Iran didn't finish Israel off, basically. So I think, in a sense, I mean, I do agree with you, but at the same time, I think it's played against the US. And maybe, for all we know, that was why Pezeshkian was actually allowed to go ahead, because he's not known to be a good speaker. In Iran itself, he's not known to be very good in public. He's not known to be a good speaker. So there is also potential that they kind of set him up for a fall in that way. That's just my interpretation, by the way. I don't want to speak for Iranians, but it's that's what I'm now seeing. I would see now there's a collective support in Iran where there wasn't before for a stronger response to Israel and the US should they restart any kind of aggression against Iran. So I think in a way it's sort of, I try to look at it positively, and I try to see that actually in another way it is a victory. Because in a sense, it's shown to the West that, well, hang on a minute. I mean, this guy is not aggressive at all. He's not really, he's not doing the kind of death to America stuff. He's not, do you know what I mean? But at the same time, that's what he's effectively done, because he's shown the crowd, my God, if the country's under attack, this is what reform means. He's not even going to honor our dead. He's not going to defend us against the aggressor. He's not going to stand proud with Iran and the Iranian people when we're being warred against. And there was a really interesting comment someone made on X, an Iranian commentator. And she said, look, we grew up in the Iran-Iraq war, so we understand what it is for the country to be attacked. But the young generation have never experienced it. So this is the first time they've experienced it. And now they're feeling like the generation of the Iran-Iraq war felt back then, and they've carried that through until now. So they understand who the enemy is. Now the younger generation have got an understanding of who the enemy is. So it's changed the demographic of support for defense against Israel, against Zionist expansionism and US supremacy. So I don't know, like I am completely with you, but I'd been thinking about it while you were talking, and I was like, actually, it kind of makes sense to me because it's played against him and against the reformists.
Yeah, kind of like how Trump, and what the lack of revealing the Epstein stuff, the complete and total abandonment of that. It's like, it's almost like they didn't, on the US end, they don't think things through. So I think it was like a lack of thinking it through and understanding how this is like turning people against him. Well, now, I think, a lot of people in Iran know who Pezeshkian is and what he represents. But I think it did expose to people who may not have known, like why you need the IRGC, why you need the resistance, they're there for support. And I think it would be absolutely ludicrous to think that this is over at all. I mean, as somebody from the United States, and just even understanding this playbook that is reused time and time again, like as you said, they rehabilitate the terrorists, but they also rehabilitate their plans for destabilization, for attack. And it's the same plan over and over again, and it's not going to stop. And the only way to stop it is by being ahead of them. And there shouldn't be any sort of point, I guess, of rest when it comes to what the United States is doing, because I assure you that they're not resting their laurels. They're not going to do that when they see such a threat that Iran would be to greater Israel. And when this administration is full of Zionists and full of the Israeli intelligence apparatus, then how is that just suddenly going to stop and be forgotten when you have Netanyahu in DC once again getting the red carpet and giving off a Nobel Prize nominations while there's an ongoing genocide being done by him and essentially the United States with its help. That they're not going to stop. And I think that there's I do think that in some ways the exposure of the peacefulness of Iran and Iranian people is actually something that many Americans maybe wouldn't have accepted until now, specifically in Israel's actions. Because just like the United States and Trump are doing, Israel is also doing has done tremendous damage to its reputation. It hasn't stopped it because they don't really care about that. But I think this generation of Americans that weren't around during the U.S. war in Iraq, that were children, like babies, because some of us were children, but they weren't even born yet, or they were extremely young, is I think they're getting a glimpse as to how this has been yet another manufactured war, another manufactured hatred against the entirety of the Middle East, as they see it, and are becoming aware. So we are ending on a positive note here, as to, I guess, the gained insight and awareness from all the insidious, violent, and destructive events that have occurred in the last few years by the new generation of people. It's sad because this shouldn't be what's happening, but it is what's happening, and it's a reoccurrence of what happened before. It's a continuation in many ways of what happened before, just with new players, I guess, and some of the same ones, to be honest. I mean, as you said before, and it's just, I mean, we talk about this. The presidents change, but the policies don't. So I'm hoping for some sort of actual counter to what the United States is doing. And as always, of course, it starts with people within the US, within the UK, within the Western alliance as well, not just the people in the most vulnerable parts of the world that are on the receiving end of these bombs that are dropped.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, everybody. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for listening to our rant and our I guess it's present mind combobulations that we're having, because as we're talking, there's more things that come up, right, and more things that you start kind of thinking about. So all right, well, Vanessa, just let people know where they can find you, and I'll do the same in case we have something going on.
Yeah, you can find me mostly on Substack, Telegram, and X. Sorry, the cat is back. Say hi.
Oh my gosh, you should just have the cat on the whole time. What is this?
I know.
Cat. He just wants to be part of the critical perspective.
He does. No, he just wants to destroy the equipment. That's what it really comes. He's like, oh, shut up already.
You humans.
So yeah.
Okay, and well,
Vanessa Beeley everywhere on that. Sorry.
Vanessa Beeley and her cat everywhere. And Fiorella Isabel on Substack, Fiorella Isabel M on X, and we'll also put this on YouTube. And so keep tuning in, and we'll be doing this as often as we can with our crazy schedules and international events happening all over the world. So thanks for joining us on A Critical Perspectives. We'll see you next time.